Welcome back to my channel. It's Vanessa Lesniak here. I'm back again with another little tutorial, and this time we are going to be painting a mini winter wonderland scene. So I this is a mini. This is a 4x4 piece, and you can actually make this, make it as big as you want, make it as small as you want. I really like the minis. I can put them, glue them to my journals, send them as little postcards. Just a cute little quick and easy painting for you. So the first thing I'm going to do, since this is a loose little sheet of paper, is I'm going to tape the sides down, and I'm just using some painter's tape because the painter's tape never does rip my paper. If you have a problem with tape ripping your paper, my suggestion would be to run it on a piece of clothing first to get rid of some of the tackiness, and then go ahead and lay it down on your paper. All right, with a pencil, I'm just going to make a really quick little sketch. So this winter wonderland scene is going to take place in a city in my head, right? So it's going to be like a winter wonderland cityscape. So for the background, I'm going to pencil in some very generic looking buildings. So really, we're just going to do some shapes, some rectangles, some triangles, some squares. Keep it as simple as possible, because what we are going to try to do with these buildings is sort of push them to the background. The foreground and the snow falling is really going to be our main focus. So try not to stress too much about what your buildings what your buildings look like. Just make them as generic as possible. You don't want to go into too much detail with them. So just have fun with these. I am starting off with just a couple of buildings to begin with, and you'll see later on in the tutorial that I add a bit more as I go. So you can feel free to use this technique now, or feel free to draw as many as you need if you need that guide right now. We are going to be painting a couple of layers in the building. So we're going to be painting 3 layers: the background, the midground, and the foreground of the buildings. So you want to make sure to have enough buildings where you can paint 3 layers of it. Okay, once I am done with my preliminary sketch, I'm going to grab the 2 colors that I'm going to be using. So the first color that I'm going to be using is going to be the color that we're using for the entirety of the painting. And that is this color. It's called Puddle, and it is from my line of watercolors, the Sprout Creative. So this puddle is a really, really dark, dark, deep blue. And I really love using this color in my paintings because I can push this color to make it appear black, and I can also add enough water and water it down to make it appear blue. It's one of my favorite colors. So we're going to be using Puddle, and we also are going to be using some ultramarine, but just a teeny, teeny, tiny bit of ultramarine, just to give the sky a little bit of contrast. So the first thing that I'm going to be doing is adding a little puddle to my palette, a little puddle of puddle, if you will, to my palette, and I am watering it down. And the reason I'm watering it down is because we're going to start with the back buildings, and those are going to be the lightest ones. I'm also going to take some ultramarine, also from my brand, the Sprout Creative, and I am going to water that down as well. We don't want the sky to be super, super dark. We just want a nice soft layer, because again, it's not going to be the focus of this painting. So just a tiny little bit of ultramarine and a ton of water, just to give the sky just the slightest touch of blue. So now that we have our 2 mixes of color, what I'm going to do is to take a small brush. This one is a number 6 round brush from the Pigeon Letters. It's the Pigeon Letter Studio brush. And I am going to first wet the sky in my piece. So everything above the buildings. Try not to put any water into the buildings, because remember, the paint is only going to go as far as the water is. So try to paint the paper with water up to the edges of those buildings. And you want to make sure that you have a sheen of water on your paper and that there are no puddles. So what I mean with the sheen is I will lift up the paper now and show you. You'll see that it's just a nice little shine of water on the page, and there are no puddles whatsoever. That's the amount of water that you want to have. You want to have the paper wet, but you don't want to have it too wet. So now I'm going to add a little bit more water to my brush, dip into some of that ultramarine, and then just very lightly, I'm going to dot a little bit of that color in. And you'll see that it's not a lot of color. I'm leaving some white space in between, and I'm just blobbing in some of that blue. Now, watercolor will always dry lighter than what it appears on paper, so it may look a little bit more blue right now than you might want, but it will dry lighter. To this, I'm also going to add just the tiniest bit of the really dark blue to the sky, just to give it just a little bit of like a cloudy feel to it. Now, after I have the right amount of paint on my paper, I've noticed that a lot of my white has gone away because the paint spread in the water. So what I'm going to do is clean off my brush and then grab a paper towel and blot off a lot of that water. And I'm going to start scrubbing out some of that paint in the sky. And by scrubbing out, it just means running a dry-ish brush along the wet areas and taking away some of that paint. So I wanted to bring a little bit of white back into the sky. So I scrubbed some of that paint out. Now, before moving on to this step, please make sure that your sky is completely dry so that the color of the buildings doesn't bleed into the sky. So through the magic of editing, my sky is dry. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a very watered down layer of puddle, the color, not the puddle of paint. And I am going to paint all of the buildings in this color. So I am painting every building that I penciled in with puddle. And we're starting with a very light layers. Some of these buildings are going to get a second layer to make them a little darker, and then a third layer to have them appear even darker. So for now, just paint each and every one of your buildings in this very light layer. And again, remember, when your piece dries, the watercolor lightens up considerably. So it may look a little bit darker now than it does when it's dry. So paint the entirety of all of the buildings in this color and let them completely dry before moving on to the next step. Okay, so my first layer is now completely dry. And if you have gone out of the lines, if you have a couple of water spots on your paper, pay them no minds because we're focusing on the foreground. So if you have run out of your puddle, or if your puddle has gone dry like mine has, be sure to replenish that. This time we are not adding as much water. We're going to make the puddle of paint just a little bit darker. So now I'm going to pick a couple of buildings in the foreground and I am going to paint over those with this darker mixture. If the buildings that you have designated to paint for this middle ground, so the midgrounds, are close together, then you don't have to paint building by building. You can feel free to do like we did in the background and just kind of paint them all at once. This first building that I'm painting is a little separate from the other ones, so obviously I'm just going to paint that one on its own. But again, pick a few, pick the majority if you want. This, again, you don't have to stress too much over this part. We're just adding a couple of layers and we're going to push all of this to the background when we start working on the foreground. So don't stress too much, if you are, about which buildings you're choosing, how they're going to look. Like, none of that is really going to matter. Right now, we're just adding a bit of color and we're having a bit of fun. Once you are done with this part, allow this layer to completely dry before moving on to the next one. Okay, so for my final layer of buildings, I realized that I really didn't have enough to make this like an interesting skyline. So my piece is completely dry and I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add a couple of more buildings for the foreground. So if you find yourself in this position, feel free to do this as well. I'm penciling in some and then later on you'll see after I kind of take a look at it that I just go in and I freestyle it. Feel free to do this, either way. Freestyle it, pencil it in, doesn't really matter. Um, just do what makes you happy at this stage. Now that I have the buildings in the foreground sketched out, I am adding even more paint to the palette. I'm mixing in a little bit more to make it even darker than the previous layer, and I'm going to go in and paint the foreground layer. Again, we're going to do the same technique that we did before. If your buildings are touching, feel free to paint more than one at a time. If, like me, you have two different levels of paint behind them, you may need to add a little bit of paint, a little bit more paint than normal. So here you see that I am painting a building that's in between two buildings, or in between three buildings. Two of the buildings are in the midground and one is in the background. So I had to add just a little bit more paint to even that color out. So if that happens to you, that's one way you can correct it. You can also go back in when this layer is dry and add another layer. I can guarantee you that even if you see through it a little, it's not really going to matter. So I wouldn't really go that extra mile to cover it up, because what we do in the foreground is going to draw your attention away from this. So feel free to paint your buildings in the foreground. Again, paint as many or as few as you'd like, and then let it completely dry before moving on to the next step. Now I am going to take a flat wash brush. This is just a regular flat wash brush. I really do recommend that you use a flat brush for this, because we're going to try to do this in as little strokes as possible. So I'm taking some water and I'm going from top to bottom with my wet brush, and I am just doing one stroke down, one stroke down. We don't want the buildings in the top to start bleeding all over the place, so we're trying to control it as much as possible. So what I'm trying to do here is wet the entire piece. If some of that paint seeps out, that's okay. This is a watercolor painting. Remember that it doesn't have to be perfect. We're not aiming we're not aiming for perfection. Okay, now that I finally got that out of my mouth. What I'm going to do is take some of this color, Puddle, and I am going to kind of smudge the area in between the buildings and the bottom of the piece, so the white of the piece. So I don't want to have that harsh of a line. I want the color to sort of like bleed up and bleed down. So I'm putting as much paint as necessary in order to achieve this. So you're going to see that right on the edge, on the bottom edge of the buildings, I'm putting in a lot of Puddle. And you'll also see here that I'm adding in some just plain water on top and just plain water on the bottom to just sort of aid it along, help it along. So we are turning this area into sort of like a grassy area in front of the building, a grassy area in the foreground. And it's the main visual that your eye is going to be drawn to. So we want to add as much of this color, this dark blue color, to that area and let it feather itself out. Don't mess around with it too much. Let it feather out. We are going to transform this area a little later on in the piece. So let it do what it wants to do. You can take any of the paint that's left over on your brush and just run a few strokes along the bottom or the whiter areas. And this is just going to give it like a nice little shadow of snow. Okay, here is where you have to be bold and you have to be brave. We're going to let our piece completely dry before moving on to this step, okay? Let it dry completely. Load your brush up with some of that dark paint and put a huge stroke, just a huge stroke of paint going down the right side of your paper. We're making a tree. You have to be bold. Don't take your time. Just go for it. Just make a nice, huge, bold stroke right down that paper. It's scary, I know, but you can do it. All right. Use the tip of your brush to guide you. And again, I'm still using that number 6 brush. I'm not switching brushes. I'm still using the same brush. Let the tip of your brush guide you. So start with the tip and then just pull that brush down the paper. Okay. Now, along the very edge where the building meets the ground, we are also going to add in a ton of little strokes. Using the tip of your brush, make them bold, make them thin. We're adding in some reeds, some dried grass, some trees. Add as much texture as we can to this area. And yeah, go for it. Be bold, be brave. I feel like I'm singing a pop song here, but you have to do it. Be bold and be brave. After we have done the first initial strokes, right? The first initial strokes are what can be a little bit more nerve-wracking than anything. After we do that, now you can let loose and you can start adding branches to the tree. You can start adding branches, a lot of little branches to the big trees. And you'll see here that literally all I'm doing is I'm taking the very tip of my brush, and this is a size 6, so the tip is pretty small. I'm taking the very tip of my brush and I'm just kind of letting it wiggle down the paper. This is for all of you out there who are like me, who have very unsteady hands. My hands are always shaking. This is perfect because these are one of the times where a thin brush stroke with an unsteady hand comes in very handy, because your branches look a lot more natural. They're not straight. You just kind of let it do its thing. So we're going to add, as we get closer to the trunk of the tree, if you have any branches that are coming directly off the trunk of the tree, you want them to get a little bit thicker as it meets the trunk. Okay, and then we're going to add a bunch of tiny little branches off of the main branches. Add as many as you want. Go ham on this. Go crazy. Just add them. So for the next couple of minutes, you're just going to watch me here as I add branches, as I add some grass to the background, as I add another little tree on the side. This is where you want to just sort of express yourself. Have fun with it. Add as many or as few as you want. I can tell you though, if you're adding a lot, it's going to add a lot of personality and beauty to the piece. So feel free to. And we're going to dress this up a little with some snow. So you want to make sure that not all of your branches are super, super thin. You want some a little bit thicker than the others, because we are going to have a little snow caps on the branches. For this area here where the buildings meet the ground covering, I want it even darker than it was. So I'm going to go in without wetting anything. I'm just going to go in and I'm going to add some more paint to that area. So I'm going to make it as dark as possible. And then I'm going to water down the bottom edges only, not the top. We're going to leave the top edges wet, because from the top edges, we're going to make a little flecks of paint going upwards to sort of give it the illusion of like some dried grass, some really small trees in the background. So wet the bottom, let that paint spread. We don't want just a line of paint across our paper. So with a nice clean brush, we're wetting the bottom and we're bringing that all the way down. If you notice here how I have some areas that are they look like they've been dry brushed, that's perfect. Leave that alone. Don't mess around with it too much. And then you'll see here that towards the top, I'm just adding in some really tiny strokes of paint with the tip of my brush. And I'm loading it with color. And that is giving the illusion of like really tiny trees way back in the background, blades of grass, of dried grass sticking out from the ground. And, just a lot of texture and a lot of interesting bits back there. So once you're satisfied with the way your piece looks, let it completely dry before moving on to the next step. So I always use Copic Opaque White, which is a very opaque white ink. You feel free to use gouache, watercolor, acrylic, whatever white medium you have. So I'm going to load my brush up with the white, and I am going to start applying white with the very tip of my brush to nearly all of my branches and my trees. And you're going to see here that I'm going to pick mostly the right side of my trees to give this white snow, or to add the white snow to. I'm going to add it to every one of the main branches that are sticking up, right? So if you're picturing snow falling, whatever snow hits that branch is where we're adding the snow. In the little V's where the branches connect to the tree, you see that little V, we're going to add a little pile of snow there. Make sure that you add some of that snow to the trunk of the tree, and not just to the sides, but a couple of tiny strokes in the front as well. And we are going to do this to all the trees that we've added. We're going to add some to the little tiny specks in the background. And we're not just going to add it to the top, we're going to add some to the middle. We're just going to literally add white everywhere. Again, remember, this is Winter Wonderland, okay? When adding snow to the branches, feel free, and I think this gives it a more realistic look when you don't just add snow to like the part that you painted, add it a little above, right? Because the snow is not just going to be a little flat area on the branch, it's going to be puffing out of that branch. I live in Buffalo, so I see a lot of snow every winter. And when I look at trees, you're going to see a big glob of snow on it. So make sure that you don't only put it directly on the branch, but you give it a little height, right? Put a little bit above the branch as well. And add as much snow as you want. We're going to be adding a lot of splatter to this piece. This is a Winter Wonderland piece, so definitely add more than you think you need. Once you are done adding as much snow as possible to the branches, load up that brush with water and with your white and tap some of it into your piece. Okay, don't tap some of it, tap a lot of it. Remember to rotate your brush so that your splatter isn't going all one direction. And just add it, just go ham, go crazy, right? These are going to give you a little bit of a bigger splatter on your piece. The drops that are on your piece are going to be a little bit bigger. But after this, I want to add a little bit of mist to the background. So we're going to use a toothbrush. The one thing that you have to remember with a toothbrush is that once you load it up with water, you have to pat some of that water out. Otherwise, you'll be left with big spots on your paper. And that does happen to me here, but I use it to my advantage. So see those three big dots in the foreground? I was going to take it off, but I decided, nope, I'm going to roll with it. We're going to leave that here. So this piece has a ton of really fine splatter and then a ton of different size splatters. So let it completely dry before taking the tape off. And with that, we are done. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. And if you can, please give me a thumbs up, a like, a subscribe. That would be wonderful. I hope that this doesn't deter you from the beautiful spring days that we have coming up. Hopefully, right? Here in Buffalo, it's still freezing. But I hope that you enjoyed this, and I will see you all in the next one.